All right, we are live. Hello, David. How you doing?
Good. How are you, Turple?
Absolutely amazing. I feel ecstatic for the webinar. And of course, everyone that has joined us so far, I see a few people here. We're going to be talking about cloud security today, which is, of course, always an interesting topic. And joining us today is, of course, David Gordon. David, take it away. Tell us about yourself and how you got into the space.
Hi, thanks, Turple. So I've been in the tech field for over 15 years now. So started out within sales and marketing, working for the likes of Google for a number of years, and then selling like search ads essentially. But then I veered off from that into cloud technology and learned all about cloud and what that involves. And part of working in cloud means that you need to understand security because it's just so important. So even if you're in a sales or marketing role, so that got me interested in this field, and I started reading books about it, and then eventually began studying for professional certifications like the CompTIA Security Plus, and just became intrigued by it. And from there, I eventually got into my current role as lecturer in cybersecurity at a third level institution. So yeah, I've loved learning about this field and continue to love. So
yeah, it's kind of similar to how I got into cybersecurity too, because for me it was the same way. I started out in sales and marketing, but it was in crypto, and I learned very quickly that almost 95% of all the projects in crypto happen to be some sort of scam, hack, or exploit. And I was doing a video on how those exploits and hacks usually happen, and it fascinated me. But I do have to say I was fuming with everything that happened and how people can be so unapologetically doing all of this stuff that is usually bad. But it mostly involved phishing attacks, moments of inattentiveness where you're letting yourself kind of go on autopilot, and then you don't notice how you click a link, you don't notice how you got sent the wrong thing that you were supposed to click, and that's how the stories usually go. But yeah, all in all, learning about all of this and getting into the space of cybersecurity, and also getting this honorary position as a webinar host where I get to invite these experts such as yourself to the webinar. Just been ecstatic overall. But yeah, getting into the topic, so thank you for telling us about yourself. Getting into the topic, of course, cloud security is a thing that is always discussed, and justifiably so. But yeah, to answer the main question of the topic again itself, so where does the line really end? First question goes like this: how do you determine where your organization's security responsibilities end and your cloud providers begin? And is this clear in practice or only in theory?
yeah, very good question. So the shared responsibility model is a fundamental concept in cloud security that clearly delineates where the cloud provider's responsibilities begin and end, and where the client's responsibilities begin and end. So to be clear, the cloud provider, AWS or whoever it might happen to be, is responsible for security of the cloud. That is to say, they're responsible for the infrastructure and network of the cloud services. The client, on the other hand, is responsible for security in the cloud. That is to say, they are responsible for the data and applications and configurations that they have in the cloud. It's also important to understand that the level and degree of responsibility between provider and client will vary somewhat across the different models. Within the infrastructure as a service model, for instance, the bulk of the responsibility shifts towards the client. With the software as a service model, the bulk of responsibility shifts towards the cloud provider. And platform as a service is somewhere in the middle. So while the theoretical principles of the shared responsibility model are crystal clear, practical applications can sometimes be a little complex due to the dynamic nature of cloud services.
Mm, mm. So it's like a perfect match of shared responsibility, and everyone has their own shoes to fill in the space, which makes actually, yeah, it makes perfect sense. I mean, when you really think about it, the position you are in, you got to be knowledgeable about what you're doing, and of course take that responsibility, because that responsibility is on you. That makes things perfectly clear, and that takes us to our next question about the blurred boundaries between all the parties involved. So, David, can you share examples where ambiguity in the shared responsibility model led to security gaps or incidents, and what lessons did you learn, or you can actually learn from that?
Ambiguity within the shared responsibility model has unfortunately led to a number of high-profile breaches in
Yeah.
recent years. One of the most high-profile and widely publicized examples of this was with regard to the the AWS S3
Mhm.
buckets. So
Oh.
the S3 buckets are a service offered by AWS that enable cloud file storage within the cloud. And in a number of instances in recent years, clients had misconfigured the permissions on these S3 buckets. So the cloud provider, AWS in this case, was not at fault. Their
Mhm.
responsibility was for the infrastructure, and that was robust and secure. But the
Mhm.
client's responsibility of ensuring that the S3 buckets had the correct configurations was unfortunately at fault. So some overly permissive permissions were granted to these S3 buckets, and that led to sensitive data being exposed to the public. So
Mhm.
that type of scenario is unfortunately not uncommon. Another quite common example would be misconfiguration of identity and access management
Oh.
rules and responsibilities. So that, unfortunately, is also quite common, along with failure to implement multi-factor authentication on key
Mhm.
accounts. So what we can kind of learn from this is, in regard to cloud, yeah, just never assume implicit
Mhm.
security. Yes, the cloud provider is completely responsible for the infrastructure, but you, the client, are 100% responsible for how you configure permissions on the cloud. So it's also really important that clients understand the differences in responsibilities that exist amongst the different types of cloud service models.
Mhm. And that makes perfect sense. If you buy a knife to cook a steak, you got to be careful where you cut, and that's just putting it very simply. But I guess the example that you I mean I'm told is
Yeah.
the absolute perfect example that you can give, because again, the cloud service provider has filled out their shared responsibility. Coming back to the first question, and it is on you to ensure that the responsibility that is on you is stark and robust. Using a bit of technical slang here that we are all used to. That takes me to the next question about contracts versus reality, because again, how well do cloud providers, how well do cloud provider contracts actually reflect the operational realities of shared security responsibilities? And the most interesting part is, what should CISOs look out for in the fine print?
Yeah. So I guess the first thing to understand is cloud provider contracts always aim to
Mhm.
accurately reflect the operational realities of shared responsibilities within cloud security. But in practice, it's not always quite as clear as that, because the detailed operational implications of this are sometimes buried deep within the service level agreement that the client has with the cloud provider, or within the cloud provider's terms and conditions. And the old joke within the tech industry is that nobody ever reads the terms and conditions. So that's a big part of the problem. But what
Yeah.
CISOs, I guess, need to look for in the fine print is, first of all, detailed definitions of responsibility for each
Mhm.
particular cloud service model, whether infrastructure as a service or software as a service or some other model. So
Mhm.
the fine print should really stipulate what the cloud provider is responsible for in terms of patching and configuration.
Mhm.
The fine print should also outline who is responsible for what in the event of an incident, like a data breach.
Yeah.
CISOs should also look for independent attestations of the cloud provider's commitment to security. I mean, things like ISO 27K1, those
Yeah.
kinds of reports, really, really important. And CISOs also need to be really clear about where data may reside and how protected it is when at rest and in transit. And then finally, the fine print should really outline how data can be securely extracted from the cloud in the event of a termination of a service contract with a provider.
Mhm. Wow, that was a lot. I mean, that actually took me back to the few webinars that I did previously when we were discussing the ISO certification too, and it was a pretty stark reminder of how things, are when it comes to that responsibility that is on the CISO, especially because again, you're just that Superman in the mix of all things, and you have to ensure that everyone is following the needed, guidelines. Everyone has their own, fair share of responsibility, and so that nothing crumbles afterwards in the event of an incident that happens. And I'm going to have a question about an incident later down the road as we go. But for now, the other question is, of course, when we're talking about third parties, there also has to be this vendor transparency. And yeah, I don't know if you can consider the cloud provider as third party, because it's one of the most essential parts of staying on the web and making sure that your data is flowing finely. But what are the most effective ways to gain real transparency into your provider's security controls and incident response processes?
It's a great question. It's critically important for clients to gain as much transparency as possible into their chosen cloud provider security controls and incident response processes. I think the most effective way to go about doing that is through rigorous due diligence of third party reports.
Mhm.
So, specifically, I would identify SOC 2 Type 2 reports, which give a detailed audit of your cloud provider's design of security
Mhm.
processes and controls, and also ISO 27K1
Yeah.
attestations. Critically important to read those. Okay? But I think clients also need to avail of any publicly available documentation, any white papers that the cloud provider has published, and those are definitely worth reading. I mean, they can often contain like detailed insights into how the cloud provider's infrastructure actually operates.
Mhm.
And I think that's
Yeah.
important because I think transparency is ultimately dependent on a combination of trust and contractual clarity between the cloud provider and client, and also independent third party evidence.
Yeah. So you got to pretty much basically do a lot of boring reading to ensure everything is fine. And yeah, I guess the boring work can actually be that thing that separates you from breach eventually in the future, because you read into the fine print, you fine tune your settings, and you actually do the due diligence that unfortunately is sometimes omitted. But that takes me to the next question, which is, I guess, a bit more fun, because it talks about the misconfiguration mayhem, and it discusses what actually happens when you don't read into the fine print. And of course, given the fact that misconfigurations are a leading cause of breaches in the cloud, whose responsibility is it to continuously monitor and remediate these? And how do you ensure this is done effectively? And you kind of answered this question, when we were talking about our first answer to the first question. So to take it to the next level, what do you
Yeah,
say?
and that's a really important point. Misconfigurations are unfortunately a very common cause of data
Mhm.
breaches within the cloud, but we have to be crystal clear about this. the responsibility for this falls entirely on the client's shoulders. As discussed earlier, the cloud provider is completely responsible for the infrastructure and underlying service, but the responsibility for configurations falls on the client's shoulders. Now,
Mhm.
it's not easy to avoid this problem of misconfigurations, but I think clients need to adopt a multifaceted approach. And my first recommendation would be to invest in a rigorous cloud security posture management tool like Wiz, for instance, which scans the cloud for any misconfigurations that deviate from baseline and
Mhm.
generates an automatic notification. So those tools are indispensable in terms of addressing this very common problem. But also, I think clients need to really foster a security culture within their organizations and invest heavily in ongoing cloud security training for all employees so that everybody is on the same page and understands best practice to follow when in the cloud. A lot of these misconfigurations just occur due to ignorance or lack of training. So that's something any client can address head on.
Yeah, I heavily resonate with your last point about that rigorous. I mean, I wouldn't call it rigorous, but there has to be a certain level of culture that is security first in the company which you work in. And for me, especially, I can make an example. We're a password manager. Password is a password manager, one of the best out there in the world. And what we go through is something that is easy to understand, something that you can learn, and something that you can also apply in your work. And it just couldn't have been better. And I I mean, um, I can't bring more attention to this than what I try to bring on these webinars. And this is the point that I try to make. You know, whenever you're doing something, make sure that everyone follows what you're doing, especially when it comes to security, because again, there might be that slight misconfiguration that might, just ruin the whole Jenga tower. And it's your job to be a part of that responsibility. Coming back to the first question. So, thanks a lot for putting that bit of knowledge in there. And yeah, that's something that I resonate with a lot and something that I discussed in previous webinars. But talking about compliance, for instance, the ISO compliance, the GDPR, compliance is a very important thing. And there is, unfortunately, a fair bit of shadow IT and decentralized clouds usage, because again, why would you care if the product works, the tool you're using, it works, and you don't really care about the things that happen when they happen. So how does the shared responsibility model adapt when business units independently spin up cloud resources without central IT oversight?
Yeah. So the first thing to understand is the shared responsibility model is robust and stable, but it doesn't adapt so well to this problem of shadow IT. Shadow IT is a problem for cloud security.
Yeah.
But so that we're clear, I mean, from the perspective of the cloud provider, their responsibilities do not change one iota. They are merely responsible for securing the infrastructure. But from the client's perspective, it gets a lot messier. And what I mean by that is their systems become decentralized. Because if
Yeah.
independent business units are deploying cloud resources without oversight by IT management, then a number of problems emerge. And I think possibly the biggest problem is the lack of visibility from the client side. So they don't see who is accessing what cloud resources and when. So that is a problem. But also misconfigurations. I mean, we're just talking about that, but misconfigurations will
Yeah.
proliferate because if independent business units are deploying cloud resources, they will very likely use default settings, not knowing that that's a major doorway for hackers. So misconfigurations will just replicate. But also compliance becomes a nightmare because if data is sitting in unapproved locations within the cloud, that is just not good news for compliance teams. It's very, very frustrating. So I guess the point I'm trying to make is that for any client
Yeah,
organization to fulfill their side of the bargain within the shared responsibility model, it's crucially important that they have a centralized system and which will give them the visibility they need. They can't do that if shadow IT is happening. So it's the client's responsibility to make sure shadow IT doesn't happen.
yeah, truly. And that takes us back to the first question again. That high, that shared responsibility, you have to align perfectly to it and not let anything bad happen. But speaking about anything bad happening, the next question is about incident response coordination. And again, we've discussed how to prevent all these things before they happen. But in the instances where they do happen, or in the event of a breach, what are the biggest challenges in coordinating response efforts between your team and the cloud provider, and how can these be mitigated?
Coordinating efforts between your internal security team and any cloud provider is, in the event of a data breach, is always a formidable challenge. One major problem is the visibility gap. If there is a breach and data gets exposed, there are low-level logs that reside on the cloud provider's network that are critical for conducting a full root cause analysis, but the client, may not necessarily have access to those. So that's a problem because in terms of understanding how and why the breach occurred. But communication is a major problem. In the event of a breach, merely relying upon standard communication support channels can cause delays. And if you are operating across multiple different jurisdictions, then these geographical and jurisdictional complexities can also make things a little bit messier and slow things down.
Yeah,
And yeah, so I mean, that's I suppose that the main kind of problems that crop up when an incident occurs. To mitigate against this, it's fundamental that we establish clear communication channels with the cloud provider before an incident occurs. And so really understanding, identifying who the key contacts are within the cloud provider in the event of a data breach, and understanding what the escalation paths are in the event of an incident. And I also think it's strongly recommended for clients to conduct regular tabletop exercises and simulations with your
yeah,
internal security team, and if possible, with a representative from the cloud provider to test these processes, test these communication channels and escalation paths. That, I think, will stand you in good stead, because that level of preparation will mean that you're in a much better position in the event of any kind of breach.
yeah. That's what we do. We do a lot of testing. I just want to bring Passwork as an example again. There has never been any incident with Passwork, and that's how it goes. The testing, and that mitigation effort that you put in is something that, in the long run, brings you the success of not appearing in news outlets as this hack happened or this exploit happened, data breach or something like that. But continuing on this topic, I want to move more towards the identity and access management, because again, people are people and things might happen. So with IAM often split between provider and client, where do you see the greatest risks and how do you address them?
Very good. So again, just so that we understand, the cloud provider is responsible for the underlying identity access
Yes.
management service, but the responsibility for configuration, that's within the client's domain. And the biggest risks in this capacity are to do with the client's configuration. We've talked a little bit about that already, but specifically this issue of the over provisioning of privileges. So, I mean, for instance, granting a user full admin access rather than just read-only access happens an awful lot more than you might imagine. So that's certainly a problem. Or not implementing multi-factor authentication on key accounts, preferably involving biometrics. That also increases an organization's attack surface and invites hackers to
Yeah.
exploit it. So that's a problem. So I guess to address this problem, clients need to shoulder that responsibility of ensuring that they are correctly configuring their roles and responsibilities within identity access management. So I guess a lot of that comes down to training and coaching and so on. But also it's very important that every client implements the principle of least privilege, whereby every employee only is granted the access rights that they need to perform their core job and nothing more. So nobody has access to any resources that they should not have access to. Any client who implements the principle of least privilege is less likely to experience a breach due to a configuration.
Yeah. And a perfect example that I can make is for access management in password. I mean, passwords are essentially the most important thing when you're talking about access. And there's great, functionality in the password manager or password for, giving these certain types of accesses to the people and to the, employees that work for you, or even possibly people that you have outsourced, for instance. So they will only get the necessary amount of access that they need. And that's, essentially the perfect example of what you just explained in password, which I couldn't be more happy to tell. But with that being said, the next question is, of course, something to look for in the future, because again, we have all these AI, automation, and whatever's going to happen with all of that. And so as cloud providers integrate more AI-driven security tools, does the balance of responsibility shift, and should it even shift?
Yeah, great question. So look, a lot of organizations now are adopting more and more AI-driven security tools, and I think it's a very positive thing. These AI-driven tools, some of them are truly extraordinary in terms of what they can actually do. In regard to the balance of responsibility, the first thing to understand is that the balance of responsibility does not shift, but it does change certain things for the client, and I'll explain what I mean. So cloud providers will offer these very sophisticated AI-driven security tools like advanced threat management tools or anomaly behavioral analytics tools, or other tools. And these tools can really help any client to ensure that they are secure within the cloud. These tools are really beneficial. They can play a fundamental role in cybersecurity within the future. But as powerful as these tools are, it's also important to be responsible. With power comes responsibility. Clients need to be very responsible in terms of how they use these tools. They need to be very careful about the quality of data that they feed to these tools. They need to make sure the data is accurate and correct. There's a lot of concern all over the world right now about AI. It's seen as kind of a black box. There are concerns about accountability and transparency and bias and all of that. And these tools are no different in that particular regard. So clients need to be responsible how they use these tools, and also clients need to understand that there is a need for human oversight and governance with respect to using these tools. So I would say that the balance of responsibility doesn't shift, but it's kind of a collaborative uplift. But certainly the responsibility of the clients will evolve as more of these AI-driven tools are adopted.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And something that I want to add to that is, I just want to say that AI is still pretty young as a technology at its core. yeah, there's just so much more to achieve with AI, and of course, there's so much room for improvement. And again,
Totally.
you make the perfect statement about the fact that the responsibility and the effort should be shared, between all the AIs, and it of course also depends on the quality of data that you feed to the AI, and you can't fully rely on it too, because again, human oversight is the most important aspect of the whole process. And so that takes me to another interesting topic. So we've discussed, one of the pitfalls, some may say, which is AI, but of course there's legal and regulatory pitfalls too. And yeah, the question reads: how do evolving data sovereignty and privacy laws complicate the shared responsibility model, especially across multiple jurisdictions? You touched on this topic a little bit, so let's expand on it here.
Yeah. So look, evolving data sovereignty and privacy laws do indeed complicate the shared responsibility model, and especially when it operates across multiple jurisdictions. And given that I live within an EU country, I experience this all the time. So it's, yeah,
Yeah.
I hear about it a lot. But I guess that the key things to understand is that data sovereignty and data privacy laws don't just determine where data may be stored, they also determine how data may be transferred across borders. Um, Within the EU, GDPR is obviously the big topic in this regard, but the recent Schrems II ruling from the European Court of Justice has
Mhm.
placed the onus firmly upon the client's shoulders with regard
Mhm.
to the transfer of data across
Mhm.
borders. So it's the client's responsibility to assess the data protection laws in the destination country to which they are
Yeah.
transferring the data. So yeah, I mean, these data regulations do complicate the shared services model because it's no longer simply about meeting certain technical specifications or best practices. It becomes a much more complex legal and geopolitical matter to deal with. But that's just what we have to contend with. So, I mean, any client now who is partner with the cloud provider needs to rigorously assess data protection
Yeah.
rules in whatever jurisdictions they operate in, whether it's in Europe or North America or Asia or anywhere else. Very important to do your homework about how these rules impact your data.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And of course, to the people that want to use a certain service, you always have to make sure that the provider of the service is compliant with GDPR,
Yeah,
that they're ISO certified, and it again, the responsibility is on you for using a service that has not clearly managed these steps towards securing your data first. And that's also like one of the biggest misunderstandings of the people that just blindly go and use certain service that essentially like takes all of their data to use it, of course.
yeah.
But yeah, that takes me to the next question, of course, for the accountability in the age of multi-cloud. And I touched briefly on the accountability here with the example that I made. But again, how do you ensure consistent security responsibility and avoid a confusion of clouds in a multi-cloud environment?
Increasing numbers of organizations are now adopting a multi-cloud approach. So they might have some data stored with AWS and other data stored
Mhm.
Azure or Google Cloud or some other provider, and then some data stored on-prem. So it's very easy to get confused within this multi-cloud environment. But I think what all client organizations need to do is adopt a unified cloud governance framework. And
Mhm.
specifically, they need to have standardized security controls and policies that are applicable against all cloud platforms, whether it's AWS or Google Cloud or some other cloud. So standardized controls are critically important for that.
Mhm.
But also, I think it's really important that clients invest in centralized visibility and management tools. And we touched upon the issue of decentralization earlier on when you mentioned shadow IT. But I think clients need to really invest in, well, I mentioned like cloud security posture management platforms like Wiz, but I also think tools, security instant and event management tools like Splunk can give you complete visibility within a single pane of glass in terms of where your data is. And that's important because it allows you to monitor and audit your data wherever it might be located. It allows you to stay compliant with rules and regulations, and ultimately gives you peace of mind that everything is as it should be. But finally, I'd also say that it's important for clients to have a unified identity and access management strategy that's just consistent across all cloud platforms. I think that will certainly go a long way towards overcoming this problem of the confusion of clouds.
Mhm. Wow. Again, that just makes perfect sense. I don't really have anything to add to it other than the fact that the next question is about applying all the knowledge that we gained. I guess I gained, and our viewers have actually tried to, have actually managed to, learn from you, David. So, trust but verify is the motto that I live by.
Yeah.
Because again, we live in an age of confusion when it comes to technology. Because again, we have AI, we have blockchain, we have crypto, and there's just so much, and you can't really catch up to it on a good level and be knowledgeable about everything.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you'd have no time for yourself. So, what are the best practices for ongoing assurance and verification of your provider's security posture beyond just, again, this initial due diligence that is, of course, I would say kind of mandatory, as you put it in a few of the answers that you gave.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
trust but verify.
Yeah, so it's a very good kind of principle. I mean, I would reiterate the point I made some minutes ago about reading the SOC 2 Type 2 audit reports and the ISO 27K1 reports. I mean, those attestations, I think, are really important for just assessing your cloud provider's security posture. But I also think it's very important for clients to read the cloud provider's incident reports. So all the cloud providers publish their incident reports, and they can give you a good idea of just how secure your cloud provider really is.
Mhm.
Again, I mentioned cloud security posture management tools. They're also important to implement because they scan the cloud and just ensure that everything is exactly as it should be. But I also think it's really important for clients to critically analyze the service level agreement that they have with their cloud provider, because no two cloud providers are exactly the same, and it's important for clients to carefully read the service level agreement and just understand the subtle nuances that exist within each SLA, because that will give you a very good understanding of your provider's security posture. And yeah, I mean, I guess it relates to what we mentioned earlier on about the instant response, just knowing what the correct process is in the event of a breach. So understanding exactly what the SLA says can really give you peace of mind about the provider's security posture.
Mhm. Absolutely. I mean, again, just couldn't agree more. But getting a little one-sided here, I guess, because there are a lot of other opinions in this space, and some of those opinions involve um, mentioning shared responsibility as just a marketing term. But do you believe that shared responsibility model is truly effective, or does it simply allow both sides to deflect blame when things go wrong? Because again, there are those people that think, they're wrong, they're in the wrong, we were not aware, and it happens more than we would want it to. But again, it has a place to be.
Yeah. Okay. So fundamentally, I believe that the shared responsibility model is a necessary and highly effective framework, precisely because it just so clearly delineates what the cloud provider's responsibilities are and what the client's responsibility model, what their responsibilities are within the model. So from that perspective, I don't think the model is at fault, but most of the breaches that we've seen within cloud security in recent years have fallen on the client side. So talked about misconfiguration, talked about all that. I'm not going to go back over that, but it's the success of the shared responsibility model does, to a large extent, rely upon the client's thorough understanding of where exactly their responsibilities lie, and it's also incumbent upon clients to really understand the SLA, what I talked about in the last question. So I think a very large number of the breaches that occur tend to occur due to lack of staff training or just ignorance about best practices within the cloud. So clients do need to take upon themselves the responsibility for training their staff and having ongoing seminars about best practices in cloud security. So that being proactive is critically important, and clients need to have a clear contractual understanding of the relationship they have with their cloud provider. I think if we do that, if we invest heavily in training and awareness programs, we're less likely to engage in this game of blame deflection and saying, he said, she said. A lot of it just comes down to effective communication and ongoing training. But the model itself is sound.
I mean, I was convinced that shared responsibility is a thing before we actually even started discussing this topic again, because it has a place to be, and you just set it in stone on this webinar. And for anyone that watching, if you had any doubts, there you have it, folks. But again, when we're talking about shared responsibility, there's also a thing about risk, and is risk shared? So who in the end actually owns the risk? Because I mean, can risk ever truly be shared, or does it always come back to the client? Because again, when we're talking about the steps that we take towards ensuring everyone is taking their share of the pie in that responsibility, who is the one that has the most risk?
Yeah, great question. So risk can certainly be mitigated through the shared responsibility model, but as we've seen, a great number of the breaches that have occurred, certainly in recent years, are due to inadequate access controls, inadequate identity access management systems and configurations and all that. So it's, in terms of the risk, as I've said before, I mean, clients really need to educate themselves about how the various different cloud service models operate and how they differ from one another, the difference between infrastructure as a service and software as a service, and understand clearly where their responsibilities are and where the cloud provider's responsibilities are. Clients also need to understand the deployment models and the difference between public cloud and private cloud and hybrid cloud. And clients do need to understand that they, I mean, from the legal perspective, clients are the data owner and data controller, and so they are completely responsible for all of the sensitive data that they store in the cloud, and it is their responsibility to ensure that it's fully compliant and as it should be. If they don't do that, the client is the one who's most likely going to be fined, not the cloud provider. So I think that the risk is evenly shared, but I think cloud providers they take it a lot more seriously and understand what their responsibilities are. Clients, unfortunately, don't yet always know what their responsibilities are. So from that perspective, I guess clients have that responsibility to really inform themselves about best practices to follow, so that we mitigate against these types of risks. So.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there are always caution stickers on fireworks. But again, you don't have that kind of caution sticker on a, given to you by a cloud provider. But I guess that actually makes a lot of sense because again, when you know what you're doing, you understand the risk, but the way you take responsibility for that risk is, of course, the most important question.
Yeah.
And so that brings me to my last question, actually, because the human factor is something that we discussed previously with the question that I asked. And are people really the weakest link in the shared responsibility chain? And if so, how do you address this at both the provider and client levels? We talked about it briefly at the client levels, where you
Yeah.
talked about ensuring a robust training and getting everyone in the loop, keeping them up to post, and making sure that the responsibility that they share is shared properly. But to expand more on this, take it away.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's an old adage that humans are the weakest link within any security chain, and this is especially apparent within cloud security. So, we discussed misconfigurations and access controls. To address this, I think so. Clients, again, they really need to invest in ongoing training and awareness about those topics that we discussed about access controls and implementing like the principle of least privilege and just ensuring that all employees understand best practices. Now, I've talked a lot about clients today just because that's where we're at right now in 2025 in terms of cloud security. Is there have been a lot of breaches in recent years on the client side. But with that said, cloud providers cannot be complacent. Cloud providers do have the most robust network security in the world.
Yeah.
The most advanced encryption, AES 256-bit. But that doesn't mean that they can rest on their laurels. So cloud providers cannot eliminate the possibility of human error, and they need to engage in rigorous employee vetting and security checks from that perspective. They also need to implement stringent access controls, multi-factor authentication. They also need to operate with the principle of least privilege and also the principle of zero trust. So never trust, always verify.
Yes.
All of that. So, and also I think within cloud providers, there's always the risk of the insider threats. So cloud providers need to implement very robust insider threat detection systems to
Yes.
mitigate against that threat. But I just want to conclude by saying that cloud providers and clients need to understand that technology, as good as it is not the solution. The real solution is to invest in the human firewall. So whether you're a cloud provider or a client, you need to invest in your staff. You need to educate them, train them so that they understand exactly what to do when they're operating within the cloud. If we do that, we'll create a more secure future for people in the cloud going forward.
Yeah. And I would like to hope that possibly this webinar is actually the reason for a breach not happening in the future for someone that watched this webinar. And you also mentioned about, you also had a little bit about insider threats, which is actually our last topic in our previous webinar. So for anyone that's watching, if you want to learn more about that, take it away on YouTube, Facebook, LinkedIn. It was live. There's Georgi Petrov as our guest, and yeah, we managed to discuss a fair bit about insider threats and ways to mitigate that. Of course, the risk, it will always be there. You can't not count out the human factor, but that just further supplements the point that you made. You have to invest in people. You have to make sure that they're following the compliance. You have to trust them, of course. But again, the point about zero trust also makes sense when we're talking about things in general.
Yeah.
But yeah, that was it. I have to say a massive thank you, David, because it was just such a blessing to hear this from you again. And your experience as a cybersecurity lecturer has got to be one of the best, experiences that I've happen to have worked with, because the way you explain things and the way you're very open about the way you explain these things, and the transparency that you gave, following both the risk and following both the things that you can mitigate. It was, just a blessing to hear. So yeah,
Thanks,
thanks
Turple.
for
It's
that.
an absolute honor and a privilege to be invited on this webinar, and I've really enjoyed talking to you today. So thank you.
Yeah, likewise. I mean, yeah, we're gonna have more of these, and I would love to hear more from you. Perhaps if you want to return over some time, of course.
Yeah.
But yeah, with that being said, I hope everyone that was watching enjoyed this. And David, I got some good news. We had about 140 people watching this webinar at its peak, so that's quite a hectic number. And yeah, again, back to the hopes that someone might actually implement this knowledge and avoid um, you know, these bad things that we have also discussed. But for anyone that's interested in password, scan that QR code over there above David's head. And yeah, you'll get a free demo for our product. Again, it's one of the best password managers out there. And David, if you want to get a go at it, we want to give you the possibility of doing that too. So hit us up and see what you like about password. And yeah, we're going to see you very soon in the future. We have a lot of plans for August and for September too. So make sure you subscribe, comment, and like, as we usually say on YouTube. And yeah, we'll see you more in the future. And David, your last message. Do you want to promote maybe something that something about yourself, where people can find more of you and how they can get in touch with you?
Yeah, so I'm on LinkedIn. Yeah, just look me up. I'm always happy to hear from anybody who wants to talk cybersecurity or anything else related to tech. So yeah, look forward to hearing from you.
Absolutely. Yeah, this was a blessing. Thanks a lot, Gordon. And yeah, to all of the people